The year was 1867, and the small village of Hastings Hollow, nestled deep within the forests of Vermont, was blanketed in thick, unbroken snow. That January night was the kind where the wind howled like it carried voices from the past, and frost clung to windows like a warning. It was the kind of night where no one ventured out unless they had to, and the Caldwell family had to. Inside a modest, creaking farmhouse lit only by firelight and oil lamps, Margaret Caldwell was in labor. Her husband, Ezra, knelt by her side, holding her hand while trying to keep the fire alive, and their two younger daughters calm in the next room. The midwife had been summoned earlier that day, trudging through 6 miles of snow-covered hills just to arrive in time. The hours dragged on, the groans of pain echoing off the wooden beams of the old house. Margaret was no stranger to childbirth, but this was different, slower, colder. She said she felt a weight pressing down on her chest, not fear exactly, but something far heavier. When the child finally came, the midwife caught him in her arms, wiped the blood and afterbirth away, and waited for that first piercing cry. But the baby was silent, no cry, no movement, no breath. The room turned colder than the night outside. The midwife gently laid the child on the cloth, covered table, and whispered words of sorrow to the parents, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Ezra staggered back, unsure if he was grieving or refusing to accept the truth. Margaret reached for the boy, tears already flowing, and clutched him to her chest, rocking back and forth, humming softly like she did with her other children. For 4 long hours, Timothy Caldwell was believed to be stillborn. The world outside moved on. Winds blew snow across the fields, trees bowed under ice, and families elsewhere prepared for the morning like nothing had happened. Inside that cabin, however, time stood still. Then something happened at precisely 3:17 a.m. With no warning, no sign, no sound, the baby opened his eyes. Bright, gray-blue eyes blinked in the firelight and stared directly into his mother's tear-streaked face. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, he simply looked, calm, alert, and alive. The midwife gasped and crossed herself. Ezra fell to his knees in disbelief. Margaret let out a wail of relief so fierce it shook the rafters. She would later tell the local pastor, "I felt his soul fall into his body like rain soaking dry land." There was no heartbeat earlier, no breath, no warmth, but somehow this child lived. Doctors who heard of the event months later wrote it off as a rare, albeit explainable, case of shallow respiration at birth. Others said the cold may have preserved his body long enough for natural functions to resume. But those in Hastings Hollow believed something else, something they didn't talk about openly. They said Timothy Caldwell was born of silence for a reason, that God wasn't late. He was preparing something the world wouldn't understand. That maybe, just maybe, this child was meant to walk a path unlike anyone before him. Timothy would grow up different, yes, but not broken. From his very first breath, he was a mystery science couldn't label, and a miracle faith wouldn't question. And perhaps that's what made his story matter. Not just that he lived, but how he came into the world. Not with sound or spectacle, but with a quiet defiance of death itself. It teaches us something powerful. Sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin in stillness. Not every miracle announces itself with fireworks. Some arrive in silence and change everything. From the moment he opened his eyes that icy night in 1867, Timothy Caldwell was different, but his difference didn't shout, it whispered. He grew, but slowly, too slowly, some said. While other babies crawled, stood, babbled, and eventually ran, Timothy sat quietly in corners. Why? Died watching, always watching. He didn't cry much. He didn't fuss. He didn't laugh like most children either. He simply observed. By the time he turned 3, he had yet to speak a word. The local physician was called. He checked Timothy's tongue, his throat, even his ears, concluding that the boy was likely mentally delayed. He recommended limited expectations, and even suggested institutional care later in life. Margaret Caldwell, Timothy's mother, didn't say a word during that visit. But when the doctor left, she knelt by her son, held his small face in her weathered hands, and whispered, "You don't need to speak to be heard." Timothy didn't go to school like other children. The one Room schoolhouse teacher refused to admit him, claiming he would slow the other children down. He never learned his letters from a book. No one taught him numbers, yet by the age of 5 he could disassemble and reassemble his father's pocket watch in less than 10 minutes. He had never been taught how. Ezra Caldwell was a farmer, not an educated man, but he recognized the brilliance in his son's eyes, even if no one else did. So while neighbors pointed and children avoided Timothy, Ezra gave him tools. Broken clocks, rusted pulleys, snapped wheels, and old lanterns. Timothy would sit in the barn for hours, not making noise, not asking questions, just creating. Margaret began journaling about Timothy's behavior. Her entries from those years reveal the silent struggle of a mother raising a boy the world had already given up on. Today, Timothy found the old sewing machine motor in the attic. It hasn't run in years. By dinner, he had it spinning again. I didn't see how he did it. He never said a word, just handed me the thread. I heard the pastor tell Ezra our boy might be possessed of something not natural. It made me angry, but I looked at Timothy, sitting by the fire fixing my candle holder, and I knew better. He's not cursed, he's chosen. By age 6, Timothy took his first steps. Not with help, but on his own, walking across the barn floor like he had always known how but simply hadn't needed to before. By then, the local children had started calling him names: ghost boy, dummy, and half-wit. Timothy said nothing. Not because it didn't hurt, but because he didn't have words. His silence was his armor. But here's what no one understood. While Timothy's lips were still, his mind was roaring. He watched how shadows moved on the wall and traced them back to the shape of the sun. He noticed how cold air made hinges tighten and how moisture made wood swell. He learned without being taught. He understood without asking. At age 8, he began sketching shapes in the dirt, strange circles, spirals, mechanical limbs. His parents didn't know what they meant, but they saved each drawing. Years later, engineers would recognize those same shapes as primitive renderings of rotary gears and early hydraulic systems. Still, Timothy didn't speak. Not a word. People said he was useless, cursed, unteachable. They said he'd never survive on his own, but Margaret Caldwell always believed something different. The world measures children by sound, but God measures them by substance. That belief would prove true. Then came the turning point. It was a gray autumn day in 1876, and the family horse had broken its leg. Ezra went to put the animal down, but the pistol misfired. Without warning, Timothy ran to the shed, dug through the tool pile, and returned with a hand-forged brace he had assembled from scraps. He fitted the brace to the horse's leg with ropes and pulleys, gently directing his father how to wrap it. Then, for the first time, in a quiet, trembling voice, he spoke, "Don't shoot her, I can fix it." 3 simple words. Ezra dropped the pistol. Margaret dropped to her knees in tears. The silent boy had spoken, not out of fear, not for attention, but with purpose. It would be the first of many times Timothy would let his purpose override his silence. The world gave up on Timothy during those early years, but he wasn't behind. He was simply building something deeper. He didn't need to talk to learn. He didn't need to walk to explore. He didn't need a classroom to be educated. All he needed was time. So let this be a reminder. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes the most powerful transformation takes place in the quiet when no one is watching, except the one who's about to change the world. By 1878, the name Timothy Caldwell was a quiet echo in the town of Hastings Hollow. At just 11 years old, Timothy had gained a small reputation among local farmers and blacksmiths. Not as a talker, not as a student, but as a strange, silent boy with a gift no one could quite explain. He still didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. When something broke, be it a carriage wheel, a pulley in the barn, or the hinge on a wooden gate, neighbors would murmur, "Let the Caldwell boy look at it." And sure enough, Timothy would come, tools in hand, silent as ever, and within an hour he would have it working better than before. People didn't know whether to be impressed or unnerved. Then one early spring morning, something happened that would change the course of his life forever. Governor Horace Eaton, a well-respected figure in Vermont's political sphere, was touring the rural counties. His mission was part goodwill, part policy outreach, understanding the conditions of farmers after a particularly harsh winter had left many in debt and despair. With a convoy of only 2 carriages and a few staff members, he set out across muddy country roads, determined to connect with the people. On the second day of the journey, while descending a hill just past Hastings Hollow, the front axle of Governor Eaton's carriage snapped in two, throwing the entire vehicle sideways into the mud. No one was hurt, but the damage was bad. The nearest blacksmith was 5 miles away. The governor's staff scrambled, shouting and pointing, trying to figure out what to do. That's when they saw the boy. Timothy had been walking barefoot along the edge of the field with a small sack of tools slung over his shoulder. His boots had worn out weeks ago, but he didn't seem to mind the cold earth beneath his feet. He was heading to the neighbor's farm to help with a broken mill crank. He stopped. He looked at the carriage. And then, without a word, he approached. The governor's men tried to wave him off. "Nothing you can do here, son." One of them said, "We need a real mechanic." But the governor, curious, calm, and unusually observant, watched as the boy crouched beside the broken axle and began inspecting it. Not randomly, not playfully, with precision, Timothy reached into his sack, pulled out a few hand-forged iron brackets, a makeshift wedge, and a set of binding rope. Then, without asking, he began repairing the carriage. The governor, intrigued, stepped forward. "Does he even know what he's doing?" he asked the coachman. I think he does," the man replied. For 20 minutes, Timothy worked. No assistance, no questions. Just focus, and then, almost as if nothing had happened, he stood up, dusted his hands, and gave the side of the carriage a gentle knock. The governor climbed aboard, the vehicle rolled forward, it worked. Better than before. Eaton stared at the boy. "Who are you?" Timothy hesitated, then quietly replied, "Timothy Caldwell, from down the road." That was all he said, but sometimes it only takes a sentence to leave a lifelong impression. The governor didn't forget the name. Later that month, after returning to the state capital in Montpelier, Governor Eaton wrote a personal letter to the Caldwell family. In it, he offered to sponsor Timothy's education at his own expense. He called it an investment in someone the world might miss if we aren't paying attention. The boy who couldn't speak until he was 8, the boy who never saw the inside of a classroom, the boy the town whispered about as strange or slow, was now heading to the Burlington Mechanics Institute, a school that rarely accepted anyone under the age of 16. But they made an exception, because genius doesn't always come wrapped in polish or prestige. Sometimes it comes barefoot, quiet, and covered in mud. Timothy would go on to surprise everyone at the institute. But that's another part of the story. What matters here is this: one moment, one problem. One act of silent excellence, that's all it took to change his life. Timothy Caldwell didn't beg for attention. He didn't ask for opportunities. He simply showed up ready, while others stood around the broken carriage, complaining or waiting for someone else to fix it. He took action. And that's what real success looks like. Not flashy but faithful, not loud but prepared. So remember this: when you master your gift quietly, the right people will notice loudly. Your breakthrough may not come through applause, but it will come through readiness. The world is full of broken carriages. Be the one who shows up with a tool in your hand and a solution in your soul. When Timothy Caldwell arrived at the Burlington Mechanics Institute in the fall of 1878, he did not arrive like the other students. He was younger by at least 5 years. His boots were patched, his hands rough from farm labor. He carried no formal transcripts, no letters of recommendation, only a worn leather satchel filled with tools he had made himself. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He didn't boast, but when the instructors gave him basic placement assessments, Timothy didn't just pass. He restructured the problems entirely. His solutions didn't follow the textbooks. He built shortcuts, redesigned formulas, and proposed alternatives that worked even better than the standardized models. At first, the faculty assumed he was guessing, but it became clear quickly that Timothy wasn't guessing. He was seeing. Not just seeing with his eyes, but with a kind of inner clarity that no curriculum could explain. One day during class, the instructor gave a demonstration on load-bearing pulley systems. It was a standard lesson, one they had taught for years. Timothy, sitting in the back, watched quietly. Then he raised his hand and said something that made everyone turn. "That design wastes half the energy. The wheelbase is too narrow, and your tension line is wrong." The room fell silent. The instructor, an accomplished engineer, challenged him to prove it. Timothy walked to the board, drew a modified pulley system in perfect proportion, and then, with chalk dust still on his fingers, constructed a working model in the school's workshop using spare parts. When they tested it, his design reduced the labor load by 41%. Professors were stunned. Students didn't know what to make of him. Some whispered he was gifted. Others whispered he was cursed, but no one could deny the truth. Timothy's mind was operating on a different frequency. By the age of 13, Timothy had drafted what would later be known as variable gear coupling, a concept used in early factories to shift energy without overloading the system. He wasn't inventing because someone asked him to. He was solving problems that no one else saw. One professor, Dr. Ezra Thornton, later wrote in a letter to a colleague at Harvard, "We have a boy here, barely a teen, who operates without needing instruction. He intuits mechanical laws the way a musician hears melody. I dare say he could redesign the very floorboards of this school if given a day and a hammer." But Timothy wasn't motivated by praise or awards. He wasn't interested in fame or money. He didn't even care for grades. In fact, he often skipped written tests altogether. But when allowed to build, to create, he shined like no one the Institute had ever seen. What made him even more mysterious was his complete disinterest in competition. While other students vied for scholarships and academic honors, Timothy spent hours in the basement workshop, helping custodians repair heating pipes, rebuilding the crank of an old elevator, or designing better drainage for the school's rain gutters. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply solving problems because that's what his mind naturally did. His instructors, astounded and somewhat concerned, reached out to the faculty at Harvard and Cambridge, sharing Timothy's blueprints and sketches. These institutions reviewed his work under anonymity. Their joint conclusion: the individual who produced these designs is likely operating at a cognitive level we do not yet fully understand. They extended an invitation for Timothy to study under their top scholars. He declined. His reason: "I don't want to explain what I see. I want to build it." Timothy believed that science didn't need to be complicated to be useful. He once told a fellow student, "If you can't use it on a broken wagon in the rain, it's not real engineering." That was the essence of who he was. He didn't dream of ivory towers or glowing accolades. He dreamed of machines that made life easier for the farmer, the mechanic, the mother trying to draw water from a well. Timothy Caldwell didn't just challenge science, he reminded it of its purpose. In a world obsessed with titles, theories, and credentials, Timothy stood as proof that understanding doesn't always need permission. His genius wasn't taught, it was lived. It wasn't loud, it was profoundly quiet but undeniable. So if you've ever felt like your ideas don't fit inside the lines, if you see things others don't, if your understanding doesn't come from books but from somewhere deeper, don't doubt it, because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more minds like Timothy's, minds that build, that fix, that improve, even when science can't explain them. By 1882, at just 15 years old, Timothy Caldwell had already left behind a trail of innovation that stumped professors and stunned engineers. But it wasn't in the lecture halls or the workshops where his most powerful contributions would shine. It was during a moment of crisis, a moment that no textbook, no lecture, no scientific model could have predicted or prepared for. That spring, heavy rains battered the eastern slopes of Vermont, swelling the banks of the Connecticut River. For weeks, water seeped into lowlands and crept into barns and basements, but no one expected the dam near Millstone Valley to break. When it did, it triggered a catastrophic flood that wiped out 3 rural towns overnight. Bridges collapsed, fields vanished, small homes were swept away, and with them power. What little there was lost. The towns of Ashcroft, Millstone, and Fenner's Ridge depended heavily on water-powered mills for everything: grain, heat, and even small medical clinics that ground ingredients for salves and medicine. And in those desperate hours, with bridges out and roads submerged, help was days away. But Timothy didn't wait for help. With only a small bag of handmade tools and a few salvaged blueprints in his coat pocket, he walked over 20 miles through mud, broken terrain, and freezing water to reach Ashcroft. No one called him. No one expected him, but he showed up. When he arrived, the townspeople were sitting hopeless, watching their lives float away. The town mill, once the heart of the village, was nothing more than a waterlogged frame. The power lines, the crankshaft, the water wheel, all destroyed. Timothy surveyed the damage, quiet, focused. Then he asked for scrap wood, chains, and every piece of iron or copper they could find. He didn't make a speech. He didn't hold a meeting. He just started building. Within 2 days, he had rigged a makeshift turbine system using what looked like junk, discarded plow parts, damaged tools, and even a bicycle chain. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Power returned, enough to grind grain, pump clean water, and provide light for the clinic. He did the same in Millstone and again in Fenner's Ridge. By the end of the second week, 3 towns were operational. Not because of a government rescue, not because of a trained engineering team, but because one teenage boy believed he could make a difference, even when it didn't make sense. Scientists and engineers who later reviewed his methods were amazed. His solutions defy known protocols. One report said, the torque ratios and energy redirection he created shouldn't work on paper, but they functioned in real-world environments. But Timothy never cared for reports. When asked how he managed to restore power with virtually no resources, he simply said, if I waited for what I needed, nothing would get done. I used what I had. That's all anyone can do. Logic would have said he was too young, that he wasn't qualified, that the damage was beyond repair, that someone else should handle it. But Timothy wasn't led by logic. He was led by conviction. He believed that showing up with faith and resourcefulness was worth more than a stack of credentials. He didn't need a degree to fix a mill. He didn't need approval to act on a need. He didn't need a title to do what was right. He just believed in the power of effort, in the dignity of work, and in the idea that solutions don't always come from the top. Sometimes they walk barefoot into broken towns with mud on their boots and quiet fire in their heart. Timothy Caldwell's genius wasn't just mechanical, it was spiritual. He proved that belief is more than an emotion. It's a force, a tool, a weapon against defeat. In a world ruled by logic and reason, he chose courage and belief. While others waited for better tools, he used broken ones. While others waited for clearer paths, he made his own. While others doubted, he acted. He showed us that the most powerful thing you can carry into a storm is not knowledge, but faith in your ability to respond. So when life floods your plans, when logic tells you to quit, when others stand still waiting for answers, be like Timothy, move, build, believe, because sometimes belief is all you have, and it's more than enough to light up the darkest places. By the time Timothy Caldwell reached his early 20s, those who had heard of him knew he was more than just a local genius or child prodigy. He had become something more rare, a mystery wrapped in service. He had no public acclaim, no published patents, no photographs in newspapers. And yet, in quiet corners of Vermont, in broken barns and makeshift mills, his impact lived on. He turned down offers from Harvard, Cambridge, and the U.S. Patent Office. Professors offered him honorary titles. Politicians tried to fund his work. He refused them all. To them, it made no sense. But Timothy's reasons were simple. I didn't start this to be known. I started because something needed fixing. He didn't crave attention. He craved usefulness. By 1901, Timothy disappeared from public life almost completely. No one knew where he went. Some said he moved west. Others claimed he had passed away in a cabin alone, leaving behind only tools and blueprints. But the truth is, Timothy Caldwell never really disappeared. His name may not be found in the archives of American inventors, but his designs lived on. In small rural factories, early gear systems were found mimicking sketches traced back to his notebooks. Grain mills in New England quietly adopted his modified pulley systems to conserve energy. And decades later, elements of his early turbine designs were discovered by industrial engineers, designs that would influence the blueprints for elevator counterweights and hydraulic lifts in the 20th century. All without a signature, all without credit, because Timothy's legacy was never about being remembered. It was about remembering what matters. You see, in a world addicted to accolades, he chose anonymity. In a world chasing prestige, he chose purpose. And in a time when people measured success by status, Timothy measured it by service. There are no statues in his name, no schools bearing his initials, no textbooks with his picture, but there are families who ate because his grain mill worked, workers who survived factory accidents because his safety mechanisms held, towns that stayed warm through winters because his water systems pumped when nothing else could. How do you measure a legacy like that? You don't, because some legacies don't live in history books. They live in the hands of those who carry them forward. Timothy Caldwell reminds us that you don't need recognition to be remarkable. He didn't shout to be heard. He didn't publish to be validated. He didn't wait for the world to notice him before he started making it better. He simply did what he could where he was with what he had. And maybe that's why his story still matters, because in a world full of noise, his life speaks louder in silence than most do in speeches. In his journal, one of the few personal items ever found, there was a single sentence scribbled in fading ink, written near the back cover: "When I die, let it be said that I left the world a little less broken than I found it." That was his mission. Not to change the world in one grand gesture, but to fix it piece by piece, gear by gear, soul by soul. We often think legacy is built in big moments, awards, titles, viral fame, but true legacy is built in the unseen moments. When no one's watching, when no one claps, when you fix the thing no one noticed was broken. Timothy Caldwell may not be in our history books, but his spirit lives in every quiet worker who shows up without fanfare, in every student who thinks differently and refuses to be defined by a grade, in every inventor who sketches in the margins of life and builds in the basement at midnight. So if the world tells you your work doesn't matter unless it's famous, remember Timothy, the boy science couldn't explain, the mind the world couldn't label, the heart that didn't need applause to keep giving. Because the greatest legacies are often the ones never measured, but always felt. You don't need to be understood to make a difference. Timothy Caldwell's life wasn't about fitting in, it was about showing up with what God gave him, and using it until the world couldn't ignore him. If the world calls you strange, slow, or unworthy, remember, miracles often start in silence, and greatness doesn't need an explanation, it just needs action.